The following episode was originally recorded for a private podcast as part of the Equipped for Life course. It has been edited for public release, but may reference training material from the Equipped for Life course.
You guys, did you guys do anything on The Quiet Place and how had kind of a pro-life message? I feel like you guys did.
No.
No?
I haven't seen it yet.
That must have been someone else who did it.
Like,
Nah, it was based.
I saw the movie. I think it's great. I think saying it has a pro-life message is like, I feel like that's reaching a little bit. Like there's a general, we're gonna try to help her have this baby successfully, but it's not. There isn't any message that's something like if she wanted to have an abortion that there would have been an argument about it. So like I think saying it's a pro-life message is a little sketchy. I think maybe
that's why I said sort of.
Something more like like pro-family, like this positive family environment. They like pray together silently. Like that's pretty cool. Like it's definitely a positive theme, family friendly kind of themes in the movie. But I think some pro-life people did overstate it a little bit when they said it's like, oh, this is like a pro-life movie. It's like, we're kind of grasping.
It certainly had an unusual amount of pro-conservative value messaging compared to most films in Hollywood. And it didn't have any like anti-conservative messaging, which it like is unusual. It's just unusually
Like as soon as that happens, like that's the new bar. This is like a really family-friendly movie.
Not preaching at us. And they pray together as a family. It's like, wow, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, mother and father are doing mother and father traditional roles. Like, this is our new heroic on the pillar family movie. That's the new standard.
Just a really low bar.
Yeah, it's a really low bar, but I do think it's reaching to say it's a pro-life movie. It's an anti-abortion movie. It's not.
Well, I definitely got some negative feedback for my Avengers blog post saying that was politicizing the movie that didn't need to be politicized.
Yes, you did.
And I maintain like, come on, it's right there. Like it's one thing to be like, oh, like this means they're against abortion in A Quiet Place. Like, no, not really. Thanos is arguing we gotta kill half the people because of overpopulation. Like this is the exact same argument we've seen thousands of times by actual people. It's the exact same argument. Like, give me a break.
I would probably want to ask this after some of the other questions. But the new question is, what is your exact approach to when someone says, I don't want to be forced to stay pregnant? Because sometimes even if you say, well, technically we're not forcing or someone because they're already pregnant, they're like, but I could just end the pregnancy now. Yeah. And some people have issues seeing the distinction.
So conveniently, I wrote a blog post on this not too long ago. It's
I
called,
think that might, yeah. I think
what's it called?
Pro-lifers aren't forcing women to be pregnant.
Yeah, so pretty on the nose to answer your question. The basic gist is that there's a rhetorical structural trick that's being played. Where pro-lifers aren't doing a forcing thing. So in the same way that if you have a 5-year-old, let's just do the toddler thing here. If you have a 5-year-old and you want to kill him and I say, no, you really shouldn't do that.
What?
You can't say, you're forcing me to be a parent or forcing me to remain a parent. I'm not forcing you to remain a parent. I'm saying don't kill. And saying don't kill is different than forcing someone to positively do something. And so this blog post kind of explains that.
So do you want to like role play a little bit? Like obviously Ian should read the article and everyone should read the article, but like, do you want to do a quick improvised role play kind of showing like how you would do this in real time?
Sure. Like I think I did it better in the blog post probably than we'll do right now.
I'm always down for whatever.
Go ahead, Rachel.
Certainly when a woman's pregnant and she doesn't want to be, and she can't have an abortion because you want to make it illegal, you're going to force her to remain pregnant, and that's unfair.
So, like, I think there's some sense in which it's true that I'm forcing her to remain pregnant, but I think not in the sense that you mean. Because I don't think telling someone that they can't kill someone is the same thing as forcing them to do something. I'm saying don't kill. That's my position. My position is don't kill. And so it'd be like if you wanted to kill your husband, let's say Josh is your husband in this thought experiment. Mm-hmm. If you want to kill Josh because you want to not be married anymore, and I'd be like, hey, you shouldn't do that. Don't kill. And you say, how dare you force me to be a wife? I'd be like, no, you're kind of playing a trick here. There's a rhetorical trick that you're playing here. My position is don't kill. That's different than forcing you to be a wife. Forcing you to be a wife would be, I'm like, shotgun marriage, I'm forcing you to marry Josh. That's the rhetorical trick that's happening here, is you using a phrase like that is implying that I'm forcing you to do something positively. I'm just saying don't kill.
So I feel like your analogy isn't the same as abortion, because I feel like abortion, if it was the same analogy, it'd be like divorce. I don't think that the act is the same as like me killing my husband. Like, I think having an abortion isn't the same. It's something more like detaching myself from the situation, like a divorce.
So you don't think that abortion kills something?
Not something like, it's not the same sort of situation as like killing my husband. My husband's like a person.
So of course there's differences in the situation. But is it your position that, this is really important. When you say it's not the same, do you mean it's not the same because abortion isn't killing, or because it's not killing a person? Or is it a third option?
I think it's not killing a person. Like, the fetus isn't a person yet,
Okay, so that's super helpful. So I think that's where our core disagreement is. Because my view is that it is a person, and given that, I've got to treat these situations morally in the same way that I would treat it if you wanted to kill your husband. I've got to say, no, don't kill, and that's not forcing you to do something. I'm saying you can't kill. I'm not forcing you to be a wife, forcing you to be a mother. You're already a wife, you're already a mother, and I'm saying you can't kill that other person to end that relationship. And so if I'm right about my view that the unborn is a valuable person, then I think the forcing women to be pregnant objection doesn't really fly. Would we agree about that if I'm right that the fetus is a person?
Yeah, I guess that terminology wouldn't be fair if you were right about that.
Okay, so that's where our conversation needs to be.
And scene.
That was good. That was really good. Good job, everybody.
Wow. That's every time I like hear someone use it or I use it, the try out toddler or any parallel to that, it's so useful. It's really, really useful.
It's like the most important tool in Batman's utility belt for the pro-life advocate is try out a toddler.
Being able to help pro-life people with stuff like that is why more people should donate to ERI. Was that not very subtle? Sorry.
So a similar blog post I wrote that was along the same lines as Tim's pro-lifers are not forcing women to stay pregnant piece was my trust woman piece. Same issue going on, and so I address it in the same way. And so the issue is pro-choice people use this rhetoric of, well, you're pro-life because you don't trust women. Or oftentimes they'll do it in like an I statement. I'm pro-choice because I trust women.
I trust women.
Yeah, I trust women. It's like a virtue signal.
Unlike some people.
Mm-hmm. And it's not a selfless virtue signal.
And it implies that I'm like virtuous and I'm, pro-choice because I trust women. And so therefore, pro-life people are misogynists. And that's not
nasty
fair.
Rhetorical trick.
Yeah.
And so my piece responds to trying to like isolate that rhetoric, show how it's unfair and manipulative, and I try to like get to the root of the problem. And I do trot out a toddler in that piece as well.
So it probably goes without saying, we're back with Ian. It's been going. And we did the really heavy philosophy stuff earlier, and now we're going to do some lighter questions. But Ian did have some more really good questions that we just felt like we're not going to add to what we did earlier. So
and we've got like at least one heavier philosophical question.
Heavier, but it's not. We're not getting into Gettier problems or anything like that. Like that's not coming up anymore today.
We didn't actually get into Gettier problems.
I know it was a way more fun thing to point to than just epistemology. But all right, I did include a link to Gettier problems if people did want to go deeper down that epistemological rabbit trail. Okay, so Ian's got more questions. So Ian, take it away. We kind of told you, you can kind of treat this as an ask us anything. Ask us anything.
Okay. So my question is, how did all three of you get involved in the pro-life movement?
So I'll do this really quick because I've told this story so many times. I feel like probably half our course people have already heard me tell the story, so I'll do the quick version. I was in front of an abortion clinic when I was 11 that my dad took to with a group of men from church to pray. I found out what abortion was that day. Some people had brought graphic signs that were across the street. So I asked about abortion. And when they told me what it was that day, I felt surprised because it was so outside my culture bubble that people would not want big families. So I was surprised. I was really sad. And then I kind of had this stirring sense of, I guess I'm going to have to stop that when I grow up. So I read Frank Beckwith's first book, Politically Correct Death, and not his first book ever, but his first book on abortion. Politically Correct Death. I didn't understand half of it, but I read it a couple of times. Listened to a bunch of tapes from Scott Klusendorf, who was kind of the first, I think, pro-life apologist. He was really trying to help pro-life people to make better arguments, and I just wore those tapes out. And when I was being asked at 11 what I wanted to be when I grew up, I was telling them I was going to be a pro-life speaker when I grew up. What I meant was I wanted to be Scott Klusendorf when I grew up. That specific thing that Scott was doing, which was speaking to young people and being interesting and intelligent and funny, that's what I wanted to be when I grew up. So fast forward to I'm 18, I got involved in a Teens for Life group, and then ended up starting one with Tim in Georgia, led that for a couple of years, and I got hired by a Right to Life group, worked there for about 3 years, and then moved my family to Fresno, California, where I worked for another Right to Life group for about 6 years. That's where I started podcasting and where I was doing a lot more speaking. And so a lot of people, I think, know me from those days or first found me during those days. And then 4 years ago, Tim and I started ERI. So that's the really short fast forward version through my long pro-life story.
I'll try to go similarly rapid fire. So prior to the age of 16, I was completely apathetic on abortion. Just, didn't care, hadn't thought about it very much. I think I relate at a kind of a personal level to the out of sight, out of mind kind of reason that I think so many people are apathetic, because that was me until 16. At 16, this is after Josh had gotten involved with a Teens for Life group in Sacramento. Shortly after we moved, he had a couple of Scott Klusendorf CDs, and I don't remember...
We had upgraded from cassette tapes to CDs.
I don't remember.
How old are we?
I don't remember if you had encouraged us all to listen to those CDs, or somehow or other I ended up listening to these CDs. Yeah, and they gripped me very, very hard. Tried out a toddler. He presented evidence for the community of the unborn, and the logic made a lot of sense to me. And the implications of that are really serious. If you believe those things, if you believe the unborn is a human person, and you understand the chart of a toddler logic, then given that we're killing them by the thousands every day, that's a really, really serious thing. I thought about the Holocaust. What kind of role would I want to play if I was in the Holocaust? And just became convinced that I needed to do something about it. And so we started a Teens for Life group in Atlanta. And kind of in that process, I was studying apologetics. And this is kind of where I credit the God calling kind of role in here, which is that I think God calls people to specific things. I think God puts passion in people's hearts, and I think there are a lot of things that matter, and God really, I think, invested a passion in the abortion issue for me. So after that, I spent some even more time studying apologetics and doing pro-life ministry with Josh, and wound up going to Biola to study philosophy with the ultimate long-term goal of being a pro-life advocate of some kind. I ended up kind of falling in love with philosophy in that process. It was originally kind of a tool for the sake of my actual purpose, and came to really appreciate philosophy for itself. And so my journey, my ultimate journey didn't really shift, but how I was going to go about that jumped around a little bit. I thought about going into full-time academia for a while. I was trying to join the Army for a while until medical things caused that to not work. And then ultimately wound up kind of back on the same track at the end of the day, but it was kind of a circuitous route. So not too long after graduating, I went to work for Justice for All. I was there for a few years and then left JFA to start ERI with Josh.
So there's like a 20-minute version of my story that's a lot more interesting, but I'm going to try to give the recap. The first time I found out about abortion, I was really young. I hadn't started kindergarten yet. I was probably around the age of 4, and I was in the back seat of our big van at the time, and I have my nose pressed up against the window, and I'm looking at something horrific on a sign, and it was a graphic image of abortion. And I asked my mom, "What is that?" I was shocked, and I was very little, and she just said, "Someone did that to a baby, and he's trying to stop it. That man's trying to stop it right there." And I thought, I want to stop that too. And didn't do a whole lot about it growing up. Knew about abortion, had a lot of angry feelings about abortion and people who supported abortion. But I didn't know anything about apologetics. I didn't know anything really about the pro-life movement. And then that same man was killed outside of my high school when I was a freshman. And so I thought that the pro-life movement was a dangerous place to be. That was kind of my perception of, if you are pro-life and you want to fight against abortion, like, you're going to be attacked. And there's like a lot of hostility there. And I had a couple of conversations with pro-choice people on Facebook that were really horrific. And so I just had a negative perception of the way people can communicate about this issue. Then I went to the University of Michigan. I was a freshman. I was like walking to class one day. I knew there was a pro-life group on my campus. I didn't want to be involved with them because I thought, one, that's the fastest way for me to not make any friends in college. And two, I didn't want to like be the group that's like hiding in the shadows at a liberal university. And I didn't want to do activism that didn't go anywhere or wasn't going to make a difference anyway. Like, I had a very judgmental perception of that group without even ever going to a meeting or something. But then I'm walking to class, and there's like the center part of campus called the Diag, and I see a bunch of really angry people with makeshift signs that say "My Body, My Choice," and "I stand with Planned Parenthood." And then there were a bunch of people on the other side of the Diag handing out like information and had all these Planned Parenthood pink signs that they had set up. And I like stood there and like watched the groups from far away. And none of the people in those groups were talking with each other, but they were talking to people passing by. And that really stood out to me. And I was like, this is the problem. Pro-life and pro-choice people don't know how to talk to each other. Like, I was just like really frustrated with that. But it did show me that that group wasn't hiding in the shadows. And I was like, okay, maybe I'll get involved with them. I ended up becoming like an officer on the board my freshman year, right? And I ended up becoming really heavily involved in that group. The more I got involved in that group and the more time I spent doing pro-life activism and actually talking to pro-choice people in real life and having it go well, the more I wanted to do that and the less I wanted to study or spend any of my time where I was supposed to be in classes. And so I fought an internal battle in myself, and I kept really wanting to do pro-life work, but also kept shutting it down because that wasn't what I wanted to do. I don't know. I had like a weird, this is not what I'm supposed to do idea. And then a lot of that changed. I encountered ERI as a junior in college and met Josh and Tim and Jacob. And I was like, this is what every pro-life person needs to hear. You know, like that was my perception of it. And I was just a student, and that was what I thought. And then the personal call came. I had a very intense personal call in my own prayer life. And I was like, okay, I'm going to do it. It's really scary, but I'm going to do pro-life work. Then I freaked out, had an existential crisis. Then I joined ERI.
That's a weird thing to drop and not explain at all what that means.
I gave up my dream of having a PhD and doing developmental psychology research and kind of the idea of a life I was going to have, and decided to go into ministry. And I thought I was the kind of person that didn't belong in ministry because I wasn't good enough.
Got it.
Yeah.
I still have fond memories of that seminar that you were at, and it's just like a thing that I never would have thought that day that we were training like our next awesome philosophy staff person. Like, you never know.
Okay, so I have a really great memory, and we've talked about that. We've joked about this a little bit in the office with Tim. I think you've kind of said like you don't have a great memory of certain things, and like sometimes my memory is too. I don't know.
My memory is incredibly inconsistent. I remember like every Disney quotation and song ever in history, but I like random things from the last week are just gone. I've got a very inconsistent memory.
So the way our memories work is like very different. That's what I was trying to say.
Yeah.
But do you remember any of the one-on-one conversations we had about me going to pro-life work when we were at that outreach?
No.
So here's what I remember. I remember Jacob, Josh, and Tim all individually throughout those 2 days pulling me aside at one time or another and asking me if I've ever thought about going into pro-life work.
Yeah, I believe you. I don't remember.
And like I gave different but horrible responses to each one of you. Like just like random weird reasons and that don't make any sense about why I couldn't go into pro-life work. And it just was like me wiggling out of like that personal internal struggle. It was like an interesting experience for me.
So had we basically all observed you having really good conversations, and then we all just kind of naturally like, hey, you're really good at this. You might want to do this full time. Is that kind of what happened?
And like, but the whole thing with the administration giving me such a hard time for like wanting to bring you guys there. Like Jacob and I had really formed a pretty solid like connection.
I do remember Jacob talking about how good you were about kind of walking through that process and
so like
getting the things done he wanted you to get done, which is kind of rare.
Too rare. And so I mean, like Jacob
we
and
came
I
into
felt
this really liking you without having met you.
Right. Like I felt like I already knew him before he came, and so I skipped class both those days and did outreach for the entire time.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I'm really glad you did.
It was fun.
I remember having good conversations with you. I remember getting the impression, like I think during the seminar and to some extent also at outreach, is that not only were you really good at dialogue, but you're pretty sharp. You were asking insightful, like kind of pushing in the right way questions. I don't remember what they were.
We were talking about like theology and stuff too, though.
I remember that too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Rachel, I have like one little follow-up question. I was thinking when you said all that. Personally, for me, I've actually not had any issues with the administration, even though we brought in a pro-life feminist to speak on our campus. But what would you say to groups when they do have pushback from the administration? Like how would you handle that? What's your advice there?
It's a great question. And Rachel does have experience with this.
Yeah, I have too much experience with this. It's a really good question. And it depends on what kind of trouble they're giving you. So I will say there could be many reasons for why you haven't had any trouble with the administration. Oftentimes an outreach event is actually, I think, sometimes harder than a speaker. It depends on the speaker. The University of Michigan, they really want us to have a lot of controversial events, just not pro-life ones. And so she ended up not allowing us to like have the reserved space on that diag unless I like came into her office and told her what the event was about. And there are a lot of like, because it's a public university, I had a lot of my free speech protected. And so if the university's ever giving you trouble and you suspect something might be going on, the first thing you should do is call ADF, Alliance Defending Freedom, because they're going to give you free legal advice, free legal help, and they love helping pro-life students. So that's the first thing you do. But the second thing you do is usually you want to create a paper trail. So that was a lot of things that Jacob and I had to work on, is like I had to make sure everything was in writing that she was saying to me. So I had to like intentionally, and sometimes it's uncomfortable to email someone and say, okay, so let me make sure I'm very clear on what you're asking. You're saying I have to come into your office and tell you what my event is about, or else we're not going to get the reservation? Or could you please show me in the student handbook where it says I need to come into your office and tell you what's going to be there? Do you do this with all the groups, or is it just me? What about this event is making you uncomfortable? Like if they say, oh, your event's too controversial, that's illegal. That's not a real thing. Yeah. You can't.
But you have to push them to get all these things to be clearly stated, though. They rule by a lot of implications.
And oftentimes there's something sneaky going on, but it's really hard to pin down unless you create that paper trail. And so, I had to go into her office and talk about what we were going to be doing. But the way I had to answer her questions were like in the emails. So I would say, so if I don't answer that question, we can't get the reservation. Like it was hard for me to be that stubborn. I was a little shy, but it went well.
Yeah. We did an interview on this podcast with Casey Maddox from ADF, Alliance Defending Freedom, and you should listen to that podcast, certainly, if you're having a problem. And one of the takeaways, I asked Casey this directly, is I think students oftentimes don't want to call because they don't want to be annoying and like waste their time. Like, oh, like they're really important and I'm not very important. And their attitude, I've talked with multiple ADF lawyers about this. Yep. Their attitude is, please call. Please call. If it's a non-issue, they'll help you figure out it's a non-issue, but err on the side of giving them a call.
Well, that was some really good advice. Yeah, wow. I'm so sorry, Rachel. I really hope I don't have to get in that same situation, but
it all worked
maybe
out.
I've just gone. Yeah. How would you all describe the difference between legality and morality, especially for Christians who, as I've talked to, many of them kind of conflate, oh, if it's immoral, it should be illegal, or vice versa. So what do you guys think about that?
Yeah, so as a Christian, I don't think that everything that is wrong in my worldview should be against the law. And I think that sometimes it's really helpful to stay in the conversation if you're talking to an atheist, because sometimes they think, that Christians reason this way. And
it's great common ground to start off with.
It's great common ground. So, and I could give some examples, but oftentimes for pro-life people to think through this question and for pro-choice people to think through this question, we need to have a conversation about what sorts of things are wrong and then what sorts of things are wrong and should be illegal. And oftentimes for conservatives, they want less government involvement. Right? They don't like big government. And I think that you can be consistent and not like big government and think abortion should be illegal. Usually the very lowest standard, lowest bar for the kind of thing that should be against the law is the government should protect citizens from violence, especially lethal violence.
Right.
That's the bare minimum. Yeah. If someone kills you, they should, be arrested. Things like rape, things like theft, those are usually commonly agreed upon, it should be against the law. And then I want to have a conversation about why abortion fits in that category. Something like Josh brings up adultery a lot. If a husband cheats on his wife, I don't think he should go to jail, but I think he did something that was very wrong.
Right.
That can be really helpful in the conversation, trying to distinguish the legality from the morality. And oftentimes there'll be libertarians who think the pro-life view is correct on abortion, but they're okay with abortion being legal because they're libertarian and they're stubborn.
Yeah, I mean, I've sometimes said a thing about how I've had even my libertarian friends tend to agree that at least lethal violence should be against. I've talked to anarcho-capitalist types, and no offense if you're an anarcho-capitalist that's listening, but I've had 3-hour-long discussions with anarcho-capitalists, and it's not my view, but I understand it's a different view. Almost all those guys even are at least killing should be against the law. We should at least protect innocent people who are vulnerable from being killed. So it's almost everyone agrees on this. Even the people that are libertarians would say marijuana should be legal, and maybe speed limit shouldn't be a thing. There's these different kinds of laws that get thrown around. Maybe there's too many laws. I like a thing that Dennis Prager said one time, which was it's not good that there are so many laws that people don't know what all the laws are, and you could actually break a law and not even know it. That's not good. There should be a fewer and more kind of simplified. I totally agree with that. But yeah, almost everyone agree. It's not Handmaid's Tale. We're not Handmaid's Tale, pro-choice people. We don't think that everything that we see in our book should be part of the legal system. We're not that crazy. I promise we're not that crazy.
Yeah, there's something called the minimalist ethic, which is basically it's okay as long as you're not hurting anybody else. And I think that the minimalist ethic is too minimal. I think there's more to ethics than that. But it's a really good place to start.
Yeah.
And it's typically where I want to start with this conversation is could we at least agree on this as a thing that the government should do? I want to do that because the last thing that I want to do at this point in the conversation is go into a really in-depth discussion about how much government should be doing. Okay, healthcare, should it provide free healthcare? No, we're not going to get to abortion at all. Perfectly worthwhile discussion, but that's a huge tangent, and I want to avoid those huge tangents. But we can at least agree, well, it should at least stop people from hurting each other. And if we agree on that, then if the unborn is included, then they should be protected by that standard, basically.
And sometimes the conversation will move in a direction because people talk about right to privacy and abortion is a decision which should be between the woman and her doctor. And just because you're pro-life doesn't mean you should be poking your nose in it. And so there are some thought experiments you can do that kind of help bring out what's reasonable privacy and then what's we should be doing something about this issue, privacy. Right. And so I use the example of a domestic abuse, right? So if you are aware that your neighbor is beating his wife and children, and you hear this in the middle of the night, and you see them gardening outside, and they have bruises, and this is going on, don't you have some sort of moral obligation to call the police, to call, Child Protective Services, and get involved, even though it's not your home, it's not your family, it's quote unquote none of your business. Sure, mind your own business, but this situation, people are being hurt. And so that's why we need to do something about it. That's why I want to do something about abortion. It's not because I want to just invade women's privacy with their doctors.
Mind your own business is a terrible response to rape and murder.
Exactly.
There's a trend that's been going on in our society where we are becoming more individualistic and less kind of community oriented. And I think one of the kind of natural consequences of that is it's becoming harder for people to figure out, like, when should I call the police about this thing that I suspect?
Nobody
like,
knows their neighbors anymore.
100 years ago, there would have been no question for anybody. They would have been like, that's a thought experiment? That is the most obvious thing. Like, that's not even helpful. And now it's like, for some people, it's like, I've never thought about what should I do if I hear some abuse going on, because it's their house. This is kind of a consequence of we only stay in our houses. We don't go out. We're not like part of these, kind of communities.
I think it's also it's unclear where the lines are. So it's like it's the ADF line. Like, okay, when is it clear enough that I should call the ADF lawyer? And it's just hard to tell. And so knowing where to err on the side of helps answer some of those questions. Yeah. And so similarly, my wife and I had a situation like a year ago or something where we had to call the police on a neighbor, but we weren't sure. It sounded pretty bad. And so we called our apartment manager. We're like, we're not sure if this is serious enough for us to call the police. Here's what's going on. Like, please call the police. Like, okay.
I think for the sake of everyone, like, be a little bit more specific about what is it you were hearing that seemed bad to you. You weren't hearing him like hit her.
So we didn't hear anything that definitely sounded like violence, but also everything's muffled.
Right.
It was through our floor.
Yeah.
Like there's only so much you can hear. And so given how loud it was, given how angry it sounded, it was pretty disconcerting. And we weren't sure if that crossed the line. So we called our apartment manager and she said, yeah, definitely call the police. But it's that kind of like, well, where's the line kind of question.
Right.
So
that's reasonable.
I think that's part of what's going on there as well. I also like the example as a way to start off with some common ground, something like gossip or lying. Lying isn't the best because some forms of lying are fraud. And so if I'm going to use an example, which is against the law, obviously. So if I'm going to use an example of lying, I might say something like, if my nephew lies to his mom, should he be taken to jail or something like that? Like we're not talking about the illegal kind of lying. Something like gossip might be a little bit easier. It's like I think gossip is actually really destructive and harmful. I think it's definitely immoral, but also should definitely not be illegal.
I have a really quick, this all prompted one, I think it's a pretty quick dialogue tip question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So this might be an outlier because I've had 10 conversations, 3 or 4 of them have been like this. Or not, actually, if you include these, I've had 14. But I've had a bunch of conversations like this where people see me as the one who has all the knowledge, because they see me as a pro-life leader and they just want to listen to me talk, but I want to hear what they have to say. What are your tips in a situation where they're more of a passive listener and they don't as much when they don't want to say their beliefs? How do you draw that out? Because it's a lot more effective to know what they think, because I hate just talking to people.
Yeah.
So what's your tip in that situation?
I think one thing that I do I know we've talked about this somewhere before. I think Tim's got an article or something about this, but it's don't act like you're this big expert that has spent all these hours researching it. Because I think sometimes if I come across as you're dealing with a professional, dude. like if I come across that way and I start dropping really big words and oh yeah, that thing you're saying is this philosopher said, and then this other philosopher kind of disagrees with it, and this is why. If I start
dropping,
brain dumping on them, or just downloading all this data, there really quickly becomes a really obvious power imbalance in the conversation. There was always a power imbalance, right? It's not a fair fight, but I don't want them to feel like there's a power imbalance. I want to have a real conversation with them and get them talking. So Greg Koukl at Stand to Reason actually has this as a practical tip when you're talking to an expert. Just go into fact-finding mode. If you're outgunned, if they've done way more research, just go into fact-finding mode and ask them questions and then say you're going to think about it and maybe go research and get back to them later. And that's totally reasonable. I want to be able to have the real conversation with them right now, though. And so sometimes I'm kind of trying to be intentional about the way that I'm talking about it. Even the way that I dress is intentional. I don't want them to feel like, oh my gosh, I don't want to talk to that guy because he's been thinking about it too long. So that's one thing that's going on for me, but I'm sure there's way more.
Yeah. And it could definitely be the power imbalance thing. I think there are a couple other reasons for the reason they could be passive. So I would explore the different routes. So you're trying to eliminate reasons that they're being passive. One of them, our dialogue tip, tell them they can't offend you. That's in a blog post by Tim. But also sometimes they just don't have a formed opinion yet, which is great. And that's a great place for them to be in and for you to be in the dialogue. So sometimes I'll actually play multiple choice game. So, and this can be really helpful if they actually don't know what they think yet, right? So instead of saying, what do you think about this abortion case? You could say, what do you think about this abortion case? Do you think maybe blah, 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 blah? Do you think da, 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 da? Or do you think something else that I'm not thinking of right now? And so then they can pick a route. Right. And it is a little choose your own adventure. And that sometimes is less open-ended, but in a helpful way. It's like in a guiding way. It's not you're trying to pigeonhole them.
Right.
But you're just trying to put feelers out and put options for them to explore with you.
Yeah.
Another word that I'd be inclined to go sometimes, which is something like asking hypothetical questions. So like what I want to do is figure out what is the kind of question that this person needs to answer in order to come to a view.
Nice.
So something like, if you believed, just like hypothetically, if you believed that it was like a scientific fact that human life begins at fertilization, like would that be the kind of thing that would help you formulate your view?
Yeah, that's really good.
Something like that. That same would apply with personhood. It might depend on the situation. In some cases, if they seem like they're really, really concerned about people being in poverty or something, it's a more compassion-oriented thing. I might ask a question like, do you struggle with like maybe certain kinds of pro-life inclinations, but also you want to be a compassionate person, or like, like those kinds of questions. I've found that to be pretty helpful for drawing people out of, like, they don't want to talk about the issue directly because they don't feel ready, but talking about what they would need to talk about can help get you there.
Okay, so we still have 2 more questions from Ian, and they're great questions, but this took us longer than I thought it was going to, and so we're going to do this thing. We've never done this before, where we're going to end now. We're going to end now.
To the planning fallacy.
Welcome to the Equipped for Life podcast, where our 2-part episodes become 3-part episodes. And we're coming back. There's really good questions coming up from Ian, so we'll be back with Ian in 2 more weeks.